IELTS Academic and IELTS General Training, the Task 2 writing is essentially the same thing. It's writing an essay on a question that you're given. The only real difference is that in the general training, you are allowed to be a little bit more informal. Task 1 is task achievement. It's how well you extract the information you need and summarise it. Task 2 is task response. And I think that's an interesting difference there, because that word response, it's how you're responding to the question. So it's how you can develop an opinion, an argument, a contrast, looking at the pros and cons of something, the advantages and disadvantages. So there's a little bit more, there's more scope to be a bit more free with this. If task 1 is slightly restrictive, task 2 allows an element of you to show off your language skills. If you are a student who is aiming to get a 5.5, for a teacher, the main thing you need to do is just give them a way of getting to that point. You have to know what their limitations are. You have to realise that they're not going to get above a certain score in grammar. Perhaps they're not going to necessarily get above a certain score in lexical resource. You can help them in terms of task response by saying, well, this is how you develop an answer. Here's how you brainstorm and how you plan. Again, in the Mindset series, there's tips about how to get students to plan better and to develop their ideas better. This is often quite a difficult one for students to grasp, because there's a set way of developing an essay. There's a prescribed approach to paragraphing that you have in the UK and the US. It's not necessarily the approach to writing that someone from East Asia or from the Middle East would take. There are very different ideas of how to organise your writing that don't necessarily include even the idea of a paragraph. So it's important to get the student to realise what that approach is as well. This is how it's done in particular parts of the world. That's not necessarily a language issue. That's it's a sort of a cultural issue. It's about the rhetoric and the organisation of particular styles of writing and types of writing in different parts of the world. So a student who's coming from another, from East Asia or from Middle East, will sometimes struggle to understand what is going on with that paragraph organisation. So if you want to get the student to a band 5, 5.5, I'd advise teachers to focus a lot on that. Focus on how you put a paragraph together from, on a very simple level, from topic sentence down to connecting paragraphs and making sure that within the paragraph, the sentences kind of flow. And that's one of the big things. So if you're aiming for something higher, if you are aiming, I don't know, for a band 6.5 to 7, then really your students should be able to understand that aspect of paragraphing. But you can also encourage them to get a higher score in task response by really studying what the question is asking. There are lots of different question types that you can get for a task 2 essay. The Mindset series covers all of them. I mean, you've got the problem and solution, you've got the advantages, disadvantages, a discursive essay, to what extent do you agree? And there are different approaches to each one. So a student who's aiming at a higher level will have to adapt their writing to this. You can't simply just go out and say, right, I'm going to write introduction, body paragraph, conclusion in the same way for each one. One of the really good things about the Mindset series is that it shows the approach to each question. And for higher level students, if they are looking at the idea of how do I get from, I don't know, a 6.5 to a 7 or even higher, there is guidance there for those students as well. It's not just a cover-all, here's the structure of each one. And a student at that level really needs to know how to read the question and interpret the question. And that's often the case of they pick up on adjectives or adverbs from the question. So, you know, it might say a statement, and do you agree or disagree with this? So, for example, people think that change in their life is always a good thing. To get a good score on task response, at a higher level, you pick up on the word always, because you're not just debating whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And you have to contextualise that and say, well, maybe it's not always a good thing, maybe it's not always a bad thing. And that's the thing that high-level students need to be able to do to get that good task response score. If you're at a high level of language, then you should try and play around with your ability to use the language that you've got. You get credit in the exam if you try and push yourself. If you try and, maybe you don't know a collocation exactly correct, or a phrase isn't 100% right, but try it anyway. And that's what a teacher should encourage the students to do. Don't just sit there and think, I'm going to stick with what basic I know and then just make sure I don't make any mistakes. Because it might be a mistake, but it might also be that the examiner thinks, well done for trying, and that's a good attempt at language that means that you're almost there. So it is, for a teacher, it's about realising who that student is in your classroom. What are they aiming for? Some students will think that they're aiming for higher than they can get. Some students will underestimate what they're actually capable of. And a multi-level series like Mindset does enable you to cater for different levels and different sort of people who think they're here when they might not be. But the main thing about Task 2 is really make sure that a student understands the question and can understand how to put a paragraph together in a way that makes sense and a way that relates to the question. With a lower level student, one of the main things that I think they need to learn how to do is to get that paragraph to flow and to make sense. And in a way, if you're a teacher who comes from a more communicative classroom, or you're a teacher that wants to sort of really allow and encourage students to express themselves in writing, it's got to be more constrictive than that, particularly with a lower level student, because they haven't got the fundamental language to be able to do that. Whereas if you're looking at a higher level, then again, make sure your paragraph's all right, but it's got to flow. This is the thing that disrupts a piece of writing. It needs to flow, so you're teaching them how to link ideas together. Within a high-level student's paragraph, you get different sentence lengths. You'll get variation in sentence lengths. You might get something that's quite long and complex, but then quite short after that. At a lower level, depends how low you actually the student is you're actually teaching, but the first thing that you want to do is get them to a point where they can produce a paragraph that does flow, that does make sense. This is precisely why Mindset can help so much, because each level, it's challenging for the students, but it's not pushing them to do something they're not ready for at any one point. So a student who might be at the level 1 is getting that fundamental teaching, is getting that fundamental awareness of what they need to do. But at the other end, as you go higher, level 2 and level 3, then that's when the real, the more challenging stuff is available, and that's when the students can be learning to aim towards a sort of a 6.5, 7, 7.5, because they've got the fundamental stuff in the bank. And it's like everything, unless that basis is there, you've got nothing to build on. Teaching grammar is something that should come naturally to any English language teacher, because it's often where they start from. Grammar is one of those things that if you can spend a whole lesson teaching a particular sort of grammar. And in an IELTS class, that's not necessarily the best approach. What is really nice about the Mindset series is that the grammar is built in to the development of the skills and the knowledge of how the exam works. And it's up to the teacher then to take what's given, and they can explore it more in class if you want. But it's not something that's absolutely hammered home. And I think that's a really, really good thing, because, okay, you get a score for grammar in the arts exam, but it isn't the be-all and end-all. It's only 25%. And the way that the books and the way that the courses are set up, it does provide that, but it doesn't overdo it. And that's the thing that I think you need to avoid if you're coming into an IELTS classroom, that you fall back on your previous experience and what you like teaching. Because grammar's quite kind of fun to teach. Teaching exam skills is a little bit more of a dry experience often for teachers. The process and product writing debate has been going on for many years, and many ELT professionals think that you shouldn't ever use a product. You should try and get students to develop language. One of the problems is that in an IELTS class you haven't got the time to enable that process writing and those skills to develop necessarily. But then again, if you're just giving them a model to follow, Well, a lot of the time, the product model that's given to students is an ideal one. It's of an IELTS 9 band, and they can't necessarily do that. So you can bring in elements of process writing. For example, if you get a question, a writing task 2 question that says, what are the advantages and disadvantages of, say, going to study in another country? You can get the students in your class just talking about that initially. Divide the board into 2, so one side is advantages, the other side is disadvantages, and they each write an advantage or a disadvantage. You then talk about the reasons behind that, but at the same time you upgrade the language. So underneath each one of their suggestions, then you say, "It's a good idea, but let's see how we can improve the language on it." So in a way, you're kind of getting that process approach. You're not going in and saying, "Follow this model." You're taking the idea of the question and how to reasonably construct an essay that's right for an advantages, disadvantages. But you're not losing completely your identity as a language teacher. You are building in your core knowledge into that idea of, here's what we do for the test, advantages, disadvantages. But you don't necessarily need to go straight in and say, this is your model. There can be some thought process behind it. And that's really what comes with experience. You need to know what you're doing with the test before you do that type of teaching, but it's not impossible to get there.